Hi, and welcome to part 2 of workshop 1. Now, I know that everybody participates in this challenge for their own personal reasons, and we all have slightly different things that we want to get out of this challenge, and that is totally fine. But from my point of view, I have two very specific goals that I would love for each and every one of you who are participating in this challenge to achieve. And the reason why I want everybody to achieve these two things is because no matter what your goals are, if you can achieve these two things, you will be moving in the right direction to improving your health, losing weight or optimizing your weight, and ultimately living a better life. So what are those two things? Number one is a decreased level of the hormone insulin. And number two is an increased level of ketones in your blood. If each and every one of you can achieve this, no matter what your individual goals are, you will be on the right path. So let's go into a little bit more detail about these two things and why they are so important. So let's start with insulin. So insulin is a hormone, but the way that you should think about insulin is that it's like this king hormone in your body. Changes in insulin level will impact all other hormones and body systems. So if we can influence insulin, we can influence our entire physiology. For starters, there is one thing in common with all metabolic diseases. Now, just to clarify, metabolic diseases are diseases as a result of lifestyle. Rather than bacteria and virus, these are caused by what we do, the life that we live, how heavy we are, the exercise, our sleep, our stress levels, all of these sorts of things result in or decrease or increase our risk of developing lifestyle or metabolic diseases. Some examples are things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, cancers, heart disease, to name a few. So the one thing that's in common with all metabolic diseases is raised insulin levels. So we have higher than we would anticipate or that we should of insulin levels in our blood if we have these metabolic diseases. And also if we have an increased risk of these diseases, we see higher levels of insulin. So basically, by lowering insulin, we can decrease our risk of developing one of these diseases, or if you already have one of these diseases, you can positively influence the progression of this disease. Okay, then secondly, insulin, I said it's a hormone, but to be more specific, it is a fat storage hormone. So if you have raised levels of insulin in your blood, we are actually unable to access and use fat as a fuel. Instead, what we do is we push fat into storage. So if we want to become efficient at using fat as a fuel, what we need to do is lower this hormone, insulin. And when we do this, well, the benefits are endless. And this is where ketones comes into the picture. When we begin accessing and using fat as a fuel, we begin to see raised levels of ketones in the blood. Ketones, what are they? They are basically a byproduct of fat breakdown. So if we are seeing ketones in the blood, we know that we are doing a good job at accessing, using, breaking down fat. So of course, it is pretty obvious that if we are doing this effectively, then we are going to be using more fat, and ultimately this will translate to fat loss or you might see it as weight loss or call it weight loss. But the benefits don't stop there. Ketones provide us with a stack of health benefits. This is a fairly new area in science. It is a growing area in science, and we are beginning to learn more and more about it. So to begin with, the ketogenic diet actually came about because of the benefits that we're seeing in kids who suffer from epileptic seizures. And what was found in these kids was that if there were raised levels of ketones in their blood, suddenly their seizures were better controlled. They maybe had them less frequently, or the severity was decreased, the need for medication was decreased. And so this was the start of the thought that maybe these ketones could have some other benefits in our body. And this is obviously, or this is a neurological benefit that is seen in kids with epilepsy. And so the first areas of investigation were around that area. And we are now seeing that ketones can have beneficial effects for people with a range of neurological diseases. Things like Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's, ADHD, autism, all of these fit into that spectrum of which we are seeing benefits. But even for people who don't have a specific condition, we see neurological benefits in the form of people just saying that they feel so much more alert, that their concentration levels are so much better. That's often described as the fog lifting. And these sorts of things are described over and over again with people who have higher levels of ketones. When we burn fat and use fat as a fuel, we actually have a lot more consistent energy levels and consistently good energy levels. When we rely on carbohydrates for fuel, we ride a roller coaster up and down all day long. So this stability of energy is found with people who are producing consistent ketone levels. Another benefit is that ketones themselves are anti-inflammatory, and I'll speak a lot more about inflammation as we move along in this challenge, but reducing inflammation is another thing that can significantly contribute to decreasing our risk of developing metabolic disease and also just feeling so much better, the removal of aches and pains and that exhaustion. We've also seen application of ketones for athletic performance with many athletes, particularly endurance athletes, using ketones as their main fuel for events. The last thing that I'll point out in regards to ketones is how wonderful it can be in terms of our hunger and appetite control, particularly people who have been on and off diets all of their lives because of extreme hunger. You know, when we have deficits in our calories that are created from other diets, our hunger and appetite just become out of control, and that is what ultimately leads to us breaking that diet and going back to old habits. But when we have higher ketone levels, we have better control of our hunger, and our appetite is also better controlled. So basically, there is a lot to look forward to if we can lower our insulin levels and increase our ketone levels. And that is what this challenge is all about. And so now we just need to go into the how are we going to do this, the how-to component of this. The first thing that I just want you to realize is that insulin is influenced by so many things. Sleep, if you have a bad night's sleep, your insulin will come up. If you are stressed, your insulin will come up. All the things that we do and surround ourselves by can influence insulin. However, there are two biggest influences of insulin, and that is what we are going to be focusing on. So, the greatest influencer of insulin is carbohydrate, or carbohydrate containing foods. And that is any food containing carbohydrate. It could be a piece of bread, a can of Coke, a bowl of pasta, a yogurt. Basically, it doesn't matter how that carbohydrate begins, because when you eat it and break it down and it arrives in your bloodstream, it is always going to be glucose. And when glucose arrives in your blood, what happens? Well, we secrete insulin. The more carbohydrate we eat, the more insulin we secrete. Now, we could just focus on carbohydrate and altering macronutrients to reduce insulin. But in my opinion, if we did only this, we would only be tackling half of the problem. By focusing on reducing carbohydrates, we are focusing on what we are eating. To be more successful, we also need to focus on when we are eating. And this is the other half of the equation. The reason why the when component is so important is because insulin is not only influenced by carbs. We get insulin or an insulin spike every single time we eat anything. When we eat protein, we get a smaller insulin response as compared to carbohydrate. To be exact, we get a 60% less insulin response for the same amount of protein as compared to carbohydrate. And when we eat fat, we only get a tiny insulin response. But the key message and the thing to realize here is no matter what we eat, every time we eat, we are getting an insulin response. And that's why we need to focus on the when. We need to think about how often we're eating in a 24-hour period. We need to incorporate some time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting in order to be most successful with lowering insulin levels and thereby increasing ketone levels. So now that we know we have to plan around when to eat, and we also have to plan what to eat, we can move forward with the how-to part. And this is what I will go into in part 3 of Workshop 1 coming up next.